welcome to our panel and welcome to the audience. We have a terrific question before us tonight in what are the varieties of non-belief? It's a question that is very rarely asked, but it is entirely appropriate, particularly at this time and in this country where there is so much diversity in terms of the perspectives on religion and the discussion about religion and, shall we say, opposition to religion as well. Let me tell you what I'm going to do tonight. I am going to ask 4 or 5 broad questions of our panelists, and they may take these where they want, but we hope that this will give them an opportunity to share their ideas with us and sufficient time to expound on what they're thinking. But as a former journalist, what I'd like to do is just make sure that we're clear on some essentials. So we're going to begin by just clarifying as best we can some very basic terms that get used a great deal. And I've asked each of the panelists to address one of them and to take no more than 2 minutes in so doing, which I know is a ridiculously short amount of time for very broad subjects. And I'd like to begin with Professor McGinn, if you could talk about what non-belief might encompass.
Well, I think the phrase non-belief is not one that I would particularly like to characterize my position, because it makes it sound as if an atheist or somebody who has those types of views is somebody who lacks belief in things, or is reluctant to believe things, or has got excessively high standards for belief, or something like that. But I think that isn't the way to think of it. I mean, first of all, of course, an atheist disbelieves in the existence of God, thinks there is no God, and that's a positive belief. It's not a non-belief, it's the belief that there is no God. Also, of course, an atheist would believe that there are no miracles, that life did not originate in an act of creation some few thousand years ago, and so on. So there are a number of things which an atheist positively does believe, contrary to religious tenets. Also, of course, an atheist would believe in a number of other things quite strongly, such as art, science, philosophy, morality, sport, and whatever other values they may particularly like. So I think there's a number of things which an atheist believes in. It isn't as if an atheist is somebody who has no beliefs and doesn't wish to get into the business of belief at all. Just has different beliefs from those of a so-called believer. Mm-hmm. It's the same with the phrase non-believer versus believer. Mm-hmm. It's not a very good description of somebody who has a different set of beliefs from you to say they're non-believers. It seems to me it's just like somebody who doesn't believe in Santa Claus is described as having a non-belief with respect to Santa Claus. No, somebody who doesn't believe in Santa Claus thinks there is no Santa Claus and has a number of other beliefs which lead him to think that is so. It isn't that they just lack belief in things.
Mm-hmm. That's quite wonderful that we are addressing one of the major issues this early in terms of, as you say, the positive side of atheism. Now, Dr. Turner, if I'm right, you gave a major speech about 8 years ago that's subsequently been published by Cambridge University Press, what it takes to be an atheist. And I wonder if you would elaborate a bit on that. What are the, philosophically, what does it mean to declare oneself an atheist from your point of view?
Well, I think, like Colin, I think it can mean a number of different things. I was once in a debate, rather similar to this, with Adam Morton. Do you know Adam?
I do.
In Princeton. I was in Bristol University, and I was in a rather tight corner. I felt as if I was not doing terribly well. So I made a bet to the audience to sort of distract things from my predicament. That if any of them were to describe to me for about 5 minutes why they were atheists, I bet them a pint of beer that I would be able to tell what denomination of Christianity they were abandoning. Now, that's one kind of atheism, which is purely reactive, it seems to me, and it is identifiable as Roman Catholic atheism or Methodist atheism or Muslim atheism or whatever. And that, I think, we can get past. I think there's another kind of getting past which I think is quite important to a certain kind of atheist. I came across this atheist when I first read Marx, saying that the requirement to the requirement to have people abandon their illusions is the requirement that they abandon the need for those illusions. The atheist, it seems to me, that causes a problem for me as a believer is the atheist who says, well, there just isn't any question here to be asked, right? It's not that the theist has got the wrong answer, it's just that they need to ask a certain kind of question and you've got to get past that need. Now, that, it seems to me, represents a genuine and very interesting challenge to somebody like me, who's a believer. I mean, somebody who you as an anti-theist would be intellectually opposed to, and opposed to in that sense rather than in the first of those senses. That, I hope, would be at least part of the territory that we discuss this evening. I think it would be very interesting to do so anyhow.
And I thank you for opening that up. Now, there's one other thing here that I want Susan Jacoby to address, and that is that there are certain words that are sometimes used interchangeably, but actually do mean usually different things. One is atheist, and of course the other one is secular. And I wonder if you could give us, in 2 minutes, a working definition of secular.
I'll try. During the 2004 presidential campaign, I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times that began with a statement that secularism has become a dirty word in American politics. It's so dirty, in fact, that politicians who are secularists never use it, leaving the field to people who use the word as an epithet, as a synonym for godless and atheistic, as in the secular elites want to remove God from the schools, or in this season, the secularist war on Christmas. I can't resist using a few seconds of my 2 minutes of allotted time to say that if there really were a war on Christmas, it would be wonderful if that indeed was the only war being waged by any Americans. Secularism is an approach to life in general, not only to politics and government, that formulates ethical principles based on the well-being of human beings here on earth, without any reference to a deity or the possibility of a future life. Now, the founders, when they established the world's first secular government, by writing a constitution that derived its authority from we the people, and most inconveniently for the Christian right today, not from the Protestant Christian God whom most Americans worshipped at the time, founders never used the word secular. The word secularism doesn't appear in print in English till 1851. What we call secular government now was known as civil government in the 18th century, and it was used, as secular really is now, to distinguish between the civil affairs of government and the separate spheres of religious affairs. I can't emphasize enough that secularism is not a religion. It's also not synonymous with atheism, although you would never know it from the radio talk shows who, when spotting that dirty word in the title of my book, invariably asked me right off the bat whether I was an atheist. Now, nearly all atheists are secularists, but not all secularists are atheists. When the CUNY Graduate Center conducted the first National Religious Identification Survey in 2001, it found that 16% of Americans identified their approach to public affairs as predominantly secular, and that's risen to nearly 25% since then. But since about 95% of Americans say they believe in some form of God, it's obviously possible to identify as a secularist in many areas of thought about what we ought to be doing in the world we inhabit, and retain a religious view of what might be happening somewhere out there. It's also important to realize that secularism, while not a religion, affects more than the way we think about public affairs. I'll give you just one example before my 2 minutes runs out. Only 30% of Americans have living wills, but people who identify themselves as secular are 4 times as likely to have them as religious Americans are. I think that's because we aren't counting on God to look after us when we're sick and dying any more than we're counting on Him to solve our problems when we're healthy. We're trying to leave the earth in the same way we live on it, by figuring out the most decent, humane way of doing things we can. As a thoroughgoing secularist, I consider this question of whether it's possible to be good without God a diversion from the real issue of whether our species can ever get itself to be good, period. If someone wants to show me that we can be good with God, well, as a good secularist, I'll be willing to look at the evidence.
You know what this does is it provides an opportunity for me to segue into one of the broader questions and to stay with Ms. Jacoby here, and that is to ask about whether, just how clear the dividing line is in terms of how people identify themselves between secular and religious.
It's clear very well for people who are from the very conservative precincts of religion. That is, when the Pope, as he does, constantly decries secularism in Europe, he's speaking from a deeply conservative religious point of view. The dividing line between secularism of the kind I'm talking about, which is not really a doctrine, but an approach to problems and thinking about life, and liberal forms of religion, is not so clear at all. One point on which I disagree with my good friends Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris is I don't agree with them that moderate religion is just as bad as fundamentalism, perhaps even worse, because it's a stalking horse that legitimizes fundamentalists. I don't agree with that, so I don't think the dividing line between a secular approach to affairs, or secularism if you want to call it that, and religion in terms of the, let's say, sane precincts of religion is very clear at all.
Mm-hmm. Dr. McGinn, I'd like to hear your take on that and whether there is, in fact, a rather porous boundary there between secularism and religion.
Well, I agree with Susan in a way that the secularism is a methodology rather than a set of doctrines.
Right.
So, as a methodology, it's opposed to any methodology which invokes God in explanations. Mm-hmm. So, if you're wondering about how organisms came to exist and so forth, then you'd be violating the methodology of secularism if you invoke God as the creator of those organisms. So, it's really something. So, secularism as a methodology is like scientific method. Mm-hmm. And scientific method is different from the method you'd adopt if you were trying to establish the truth about the universe through the consultation of sacred texts and people who are authorities on sacred texts. Those are the two different methodologies. As to the content of them, the content may not be all that different in certain ways. I mean, people who are Christians may believe many of the same things about the universe that people who are atheists believe, if they believe in basic science, basic geography, basic history. So the content might not be that different. But the mental approach and what you accept as a legitimate way of explaining things, that does, I think, differ fairly sharply.
Mm. And Dr. Turner, the bright line then may be the mental approach. Is that how you would characterize it, or do you have a different view on this?
I think I'd have a rather different take altogether on this. Mentioning Dawkins and kind of reactive forms of atheism, because I think of him as being just that. He just seems like an inverted version of the position which he opposes. Like this, you've got to play evolution and creation off against one another. So any space occupied by evolution as an account of things has to expel God from it and vice versa. So it doesn't seem to me to make a lot of difference from the point of view of mental attitude whether you're a Dawkins or a creationist, because they seem to be playing roughly on the same playing field. That's why, as I say, I think a much more interesting form of atheism is one which says, look, there aren't any questions here, either in general or in relation to the conduct of secular affairs. And with that, I by and large agree with both the previous speakers. I don't think that knowing why murdering people is wrong requires any appeal to the divine. I think you just have to know, you just have to know human beings and look at human beings and see what human beings are and see why it is, given that we're the sort of beings that we are, that's not the sort of conduct we should engage in. So I actually think, as a matter of fact, that historically, the origin of the word secular is Christian. Is an attempt to define the sacred as against the secular in order precisely to liberate a territory of the secular, so that one can then define with some degree of adequacy, one hopes, the territory of the sacred. But to polarize them right from the start seems to me a very fundamentalist sort of thing to do. So the fundamentalism of Dawkins is, it seems to me, all of a piece in terms of mentality, if that's the way you want to talk about it, with the fundamentalism that he abandons. And I would simply say a plague on both your houses, frankly.
No, I'm sorry. Over and over you hear this, and secularism and atheism are two different things, as I think we've all established. But the idea that there is atheist fundamentalism that is the equivalent of religious fundamentalism, it's simply not so. And there's somebody long before Richard Dawkins who was called an atheist, and his name is Robert Ingersoll, and some of you know who he was, but he's one of those people who, because American history has so erased so many of its agnostic and free-thinking figures, is not known. Robert Green Ingersoll, who was known as the Great Agnostic, he was famous in the last quarter of the 19th century, spoke to more people than any American president. And when he was interviewed, he was asked what the difference between an atheist and an agnostic is. And I think if someone had asked him what's the difference between an atheist fundamentalist and a religious fundamentalist, he would have replied quite differently. What he said is there's no difference between an atheist and an agnostic, because he defined an atheist as not someone who says, I know, or I can prove there's no God. He said an atheist is an agnostic, and an agnostic is an atheist. You can no more prove that there isn't a God than that there is a God. What both the atheist and the agnostic says is, on the basis of all the evidence I can see, I don't believe there is a God. I don't think that is not fundamentalism. Fundamentalism says, I know. I would never say to you, I know there is no God. And I think that's what Ingersoll was saying. And that is why I think it is quite wrong to talk about atheist fundamentalism in the same terms as religious.
You wouldn't say that, but Dawkins does.
Okay, but
I'm
let me
not
just
here
jump in here for
to
one
answer
minute
for
here.
Richard Dawkins.
I will
want to say something.
By the
about
way, Robert Green Ingersoll's birthplace is available for visiting. It is on Seneca Lake in upstate New York. It is a shrine, if one may.
A great place.
And a great place, yes. Now, and he's worth reading about. But now, there are these we're getting out different terms. You mentioned agnosticism. There are ways that people would define it differently. We have mentioned the City University of New York Graduate Center survey, tremendous population survey of religious belief in America, which identified a large chunk of the American public as unaffiliated, which in itself is another word. But I want to get at something that Dr. McGinn, you said, I believe, in one of your interviews with Jonathan Miller that was included in the atheism tapes. You referred to yourself, and correct me if I'm wrong, as an anti-theist, which is another way of coming at this whole issue. Would you please describe that and what that involves, what responsibility that involves?
Well, let me define 4 different positions: agnosticism, atheism, anti-theism, and post-theism. I'm really a post-theist. But yeah. I'm also an anti-theist, but I'm really a post-theist. But let me just say something about the agnostic versus atheist and religious fundamentalism versus atheist fundamentalism. Sometimes people say, if you say you're an atheist, that you must be a dogmatic person because you are asserting things that can't be known, that there is no God, for example. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, if you're criticizing somebody who asserts that there is a God, you're saying to them, well, you're being dogmatic, and how can you really know? So the only rational position, it's said, is agnosticism. We don't know whether or not there's a God. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now, I don't agree with this point of view at all. I think there are 2 notions of agnosticism which have to be separated. I call them reasonable agnosticism and excessive agnosticism, or I even call it dogmatic agnosticism. Mm-hmm. So the reasonable kind is where there's evidence for something and there's evidence against it. Mm-hmm. And you can't decide whether that thing is true because there's evidence for and there's evidence against. You're wondering whether we should go to being at war in Afghanistan. You can argue one side, you can argue the other. Is there dark matter? There's arguments for, there's arguments against it. Nobody, any sensible person would say it's difficult to say there's arguments on both sides. I don't think that's the case with the question of the existence of God, however. I don't think there are arguments on both sides or evidence on both sides so that a rational person will say, well, I can't really say one way or the other. Any more, to go back to my other example about the existence of Santa Claus, no sane person thinks there's an open question about whether Santa Claus exists. There's evidence for, there's evidence against. We have to be agnostic about it. They don't think that. They think there's no Santa Claus. Why do they think that? Because there's no evidence for it, because it's an inherently preposterous idea that Santa Claus flies through the air I could have said God is a wonderful slip of the tongue. Comes through the, and people have looked at the North Pole and they haven't found Santa Claus, and it just doesn't make any sense. So they reasonably conclude there is no Santa Claus. So it's perfectly rational sometimes to conclude there is no entity of a certain kind. That's not inherently dogmatic. If I say to you, there's no dragon in this room breathing fire in the middle of the room, you won't say to me, how can you assert such a thing? You're a dogmatic person. No, all the empirical evidence we have is there's no dragon in the middle of the room. So it's only somebody who, the excessive agnosticism is somebody who says, you can't prove that there is no God. You can't prove it the way you can prove a mathematical theorem. That's true. Philosophical skeptics have pointed out for 2,000 years, almost nothing can be proved in that sense. Descartes, the person who made that point. Nothing is absolutely certain. That doesn't mean you can't have very good evidence against the existence of something, and very good reason to disbelieve in that thing. The problem of evil is one argument, of course, against the existence of God, but there's a lot to be said about why the idea seems preposterous and why it's perfectly rational not to believe in God. My point, I'm not trying to give you the arguments now, I'm just saying that for somebody who thinks they have arguments against God, then it's not irrational to say that you're an atheist as opposed to an agnostic. Let me talk about the antitheism and the post-theism quickly, as quick as I can. Antitheism means you're against the belief in God and you're against religion. You wish it wasn't so. It doesn't mean you want to wipe them out. It doesn't mean that. It just means you wish it wasn't so. I mean, I'm anti-Scientology. I'm anti-Christian Science. I wish they weren't so. I don't think they shouldn't be so. Post-theism, why I say I'm a post-theist, really is, post-theist is somebody who doesn't really think there's an issue anymore. It just belongs to the past. It's just like the idea of if you're a post-polytheist. Nobody today we don't have a debate now among some of us who are polytheists and some of us are monotheists, and we're not arguing about that anymore. It used to be so if you had this panel a long time ago when polytheism was a live option. So now nobody thinks this is a sensible live issue of whether polytheism is true. We're post-polytheist. Well, I'm post-theist just in the sense that I don't think there's any gods. There's zero gods rather than one. Just as I'm a post-polytheist, and I guess everybody is in this room and elsewhere, who thinks there's not more than one God. So that's what I mean by being a post-theist. It's somebody who doesn't really think the issue is a live issue. So it's not an issue I think about myself at all, and haven't done for 20-odd years, really, since I came to the views that I have. The only times I ever think about it is when I'm asked to be on these panels. And but it is not something that goes through my mind very much. And to me, it's sort of a dead issue. It's just that people out there think it's so. So I think, well, okay, I'll talk about it, but it's not for me an issue.
Well, nonetheless, to use the term anti-theist is a provocative term, and it sort of begs a definition and a response as to how one interacts then with theists. One thing to take one thing you said there and ask Dr. Turner about this: does the absence of proof of non-existence matter?
No.
No.
No. I mean, just to clear up a point that Susan took me up on, I was only talking about Dawkins in order to describe a way of conducting the argument which seemed to me to be unsatisfactory. From the point of view of what you and Colin have both been describing as atheism, as it were, as methodological in character. Methodologically, it seems to me Dawkins is all of a piece with the fundamentalists whom he opposes. Let's get that out of the way, because what's much more interesting is what Colin is describing. That is to say, the mentality of the person for whom the answer there is a God is to a question which simply doesn't arise. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that that is the question to which the answer is going to be God, if there is going to be an answer to that effect, is worthwhile entertaining. I think there is a question here, and it can't be a matter of indifference whether there is or is not a question.
No, I don't think there's no question, or it's a matter of indifference. I've just decided my opinion on it a long time ago, and so it's not something I revisit or rethink. Or
well, for the sake of our audience, let's not shut down the debate here on this. I mean, if you have moved beyond this, are you saying that there is no grounds for an intellectual discussion? Because I think that's what I hear Dr. Turner saying.
There's a good deal of grounds for intellectual discussion, as there is on the question of polytheism. You can have an interesting discussion about polytheism. It was held by most human beings until relatively recently. And you can decide what you think. Most people have decided that polytheism is false nowadays. I think that's
that may be a Western perspective.
I cannot imagine why anybody thinks that the idea of one God is any more valid or less preposterous than the idea of many gods. But I would just like to add something. I think all of these terms you're using, and I'm the only non-philosopher on the panel. I think that talking about all of these things, atheism, agnosticism, post-theism, anti-theism is another thing. If you actively hate religion and want to wipe religion out, that's quite another thing. But I think that these are all the same things, and I would remind you that the word agnostic, which was actually invented by Thomas Huxley, the great popularizer of Darwin's theory of evolution, was not invented as though it really meant anything. What he invented it for was as a softer alternative to the term atheist, which is a much older word, which has been in use for a much longer period of time, which is always an epithet. And frankly, I think people who insist on a distinction between agnosticism and atheism today are just doing it because atheism is such a naughty word in America, much more naughty word than secularism. And I don't think it means anything. I think it's the coward's word for atheist.
Well, it's a naughty word among politicians. We certainly know that.
It's a naughty word. It's a naughty word altogether. I can tell you that it's very. I never expected to be asked about atheism when I wrote Freethinkers, because they're, first of all, I just wasn't writing about atheism. It wasn't really relevant to the founders. Most of them were not atheists. And when people, for instance, in Jewish congregations would ask me what I was an atheist, and they would say, "Oh, you mean what do you believe?" I'd say, "I'm an atheist." First time I'd ever had to say that, it never came up. And they'd say, "Oh, it means you believe in nothing." I'm telling you that saying you're an atheist in most of America, not in this room, is something which already lowers your audience's opinion of you.
I've heard it said that it's an impolite word. But I want to get back, Dr. Turner, to what you were saying before. In the way of sort of opening the questions, starting the debate, you believe it is more possible with either Ms. Jacoby or with Dr. McGinn here than it is with a Richard Dawkins, whom I assume is a familiar personality to most people in the audience.
Yeah. I'm in a minority here, aren't I, as well as being overdressed. When you say, Colin, that God isn't there, what are you saying isn't there? I'd quite like an account of what it is you're saying there isn't.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean? Because I'm not at all sure that what I would want to affirm would necessarily be what you would want to deny. Because I think we'd probably agree on a lot of the denials that you go in for.
Well, there's no supernatural being who is concerned about human welfare, who created the universe and has a particular interest in the human species, who's benevolent, who sent his son to Earth, or has had any form of contact with human beings. There's no such thing as that.
Right. So the bit that I would want to perhaps hang on to as a sort of minimum of any kind of God I would believe in is creator of all things out of nothing. and that you would deny. Right. That I would affirm. There we are opposed, straightforwardly. But I think one would need to press a little bit further down the line in order to get clear as to what one meant by creator, for example.
Well, yeah, it has to have the attributes of a person in some way, otherwise, of course, trivially, something created the universe. Maybe it was the Big Bang, maybe it was the state of the universe before the Big Bang. It created the universe. But to call that God, of course, is playing with words unless we attribute something like personal characteristics to God.
Well,
design,
I mean, one reason
intention,
why Big Bang wouldn't do for me anyway would be that the sort of central core Christian doctrine of creation is creation out of nothing. A very, very curious phrase, because as Thomas Aquinas points out, the negation there is actually a negation of the out of. There isn't any out of going here, and Big Bang's got to be out of something. So one's talking about a very paradoxical and very difficult sort of phrase. Now, I think it would, as you say, follow from this account that if one could make sense of creation out of nothing, that one would be talking about something which has some sort of personal characteristics. Though I would, in common with the traditions of Christian theology, be very reluctant to talk about God as a person, simply because our ordinary secular notions of personhood couldn't apply in that case. So, yes, there are complicated issues here, but they are complicated, and I am just a little bit concerned about a rather oversimplified way of denying it, do you see what I mean? I have no wish to support some of the caricatures which would come most easily by way of denial. And I think one needs to press the atheist a bit further here, which is when I wrote that paper, you see, and that you referred to at the beginning, How to Be an Atheist, I was suggesting that being an atheist actually takes quite a lot of hard work. It's not just the thing you can just do off the cuff and sort of say, oh, well, I just don't believe in anything. I just don't believe in God or whatever it is. You can, of course, but if you want to engage in any kind of debate about the issue, then I think you do have to work at what it is that you are denying, because there are all sorts of...
In other words, you
why?
You can't, in other words, you can't simply
gentlemen,
shut
really?
this down.
No, I do. This is why it is so ridiculous to debate things about the existence of God, because science and religion have one thing in common. Science cannot tell us how the first piece of matter, how the first atom, whatever you want to call it, got started, and neither can religion. The difference between...
So you say.
I say that science and religion, please, if you're saying that you have any more proof, and neither does science have any proof of how the first matter started. Now, you can decide it's God, and the answer of the scientist to this is farther along, in the words of the old spiritual, we'll know more about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. But the fact is that nobody has any answer to how any answer in terms of something that you can prove. Like, these flowers are sitting here, we're all sitting here, and they're postmodernists who would disagree with that. But what science says is, maybe we'll find an explanation someday. What religion says is, I have the explanation, and I call it God.
Nope.
Well, wait, let's...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead with that.
It's so important to be clear about what you're denying. And I think, in fairness to religion, you do have to listen to what religions actually say about this, rather than caricature it, which is, I think, what you've just done. Among other things, by supposing that an answer could be given either by religion or by science concerning the same issue, which is to beg an awful lot of questions about the relationship between religion and science, and beg them wrongly, in my view, namely that they are alternative answers to the same question. That's what I was trying to say at the very beginning. They are not competing over common territory. So the sort of question that religion answers is precisely not the sort of question which a scientist may or may not be able to answer.
The idea of how all this got to be is a fundamental question for all human beings. You say you have the answer. Science says maybe we'll have it someday.
Well, it sounds as if we're at the sort of position then, Dr. Turner, of agreeing perhaps with what Carl Sagan said, that we have two non-overlapping magisteria here in terms of religion. and science. Now, I think two people don't necessarily agree with it, but it's a proposition that certainly has been put forward there. It's one that can be debated. I'd like to move us along in another area right now. We can come back to this. But coming from a news media background, one thing the news media often seems to be scandalized by, and I wonder if, Dr. Turner, if you would take this, and then we'll move on to our other panelists on this, is the place of doubt. That in general, doubt is seen as something negative and something that points up the deficiencies of religious systems. Is it in fact that way?
Depends on the nature and quality of doubt. Again, you see, I mean, like atheism, one needs to make distinctions between kinds of denial, so one needs to make distinctions between kinds of doubt. Expelling false gods is a major theme of ascetical Christian practice. I mean, learning how to get the godlets, as it were, out of your system in order to discover the unknowability of the one God is something which is the theme in John of the Cross. It's a theme in conventional Christian spirituality, going right back to Augustine and earlier. And that process, as it were, of internalizing the atheist critique as part of an ascetical way towards God is a kind of doubt which I think it is absolutely essential that any honest mind entertains. I mean, I'm in alliance with a great deal of what you guys are talking about here, because there are so many false gods, so many idolatrous forms of worship, so many that Christianity itself has been responsible for, so many that Islam at the moment is responsible for, so many that the people you critique as engaged in the name of Christianity in American right-wing politics, they are responsible. In respect of those, yes, of course one has to be an atheist, because the real problem for Christianity has always been the problem of idolatry, of worshipping the false gods. Right? And that was always the problem for Judaism. The history of its literatures is littered with failures of the people of Israel to worship the true God. Why? Because they are worshipping false gods, gods of power. And then this poor guy in the rump end of the Roman Empire comes along and says something about God which seems so atheistical to his contemporaries that they have to see him off the scene, and they do. Why? Because he said, I am not offering you a God of power. I'm not offering you power at all. What I'm offering you is more likely to end in your death than anything else. That's a very different conception of the route to God, which means that you're constantly having to doubt.
I think we're coming back to something you said earlier, and that is that there is certainly a place and perhaps a necessity from a Christian standpoint for there to be a dialogue between religious believers and atheists if there is this benefit in it, as you say. Dr. McGinn,
I'm very interested in what Dennis just said, actually, because he just made me think something that never occurred to me before, which is believers are also atheists.
Yes.
Because as he was saying, he believes in a certain God, in other words, the certain religious beliefs he thinks are true, but the vast majority of the religious beliefs people hold, he thinks are false.
I do.
So the gods worshipped by the vast majority of people he thinks are non-existent gods. So he's an atheist about all of those gods. And I think he's epistemologically on solid ground to be an atheist about them. The difference is just I go one further.
I know.
Think there are none. But we agree about the basic epistemological situation,
right.
and also about the merits of particular gods who are worshipped. And we think there are no such gods as those gods, and we know how to define them.
Sure.
And we know there are no such things as those. So it's interesting that often, of course, the atheist is criticized by the theist for being this dogmatic rejecter, but actually, the way you're describing it, so also is this believer.
Well, I have to say,
I think it's fine. I'm not criticizing.
I think this is terribly important because you see, I'm all along with your rhetoric, and I repeated some of it, of attack from a certain position on appalling forms of Christianity. But actually, I'm talking about a personal story because one's tendency as a believer, to identify God with petty godlets of power is permanent, constant, and subject necessarily to a permanent kind of critique. I call it an asceticism, and I think it's a very, very necessary one. So I am talking about myself as much as anybody else. Right?
That's
and
great.
I think we all have to do
Okay,
that.
that's very important. We're getting to personal stories, and what I wanted to ask both Susan Jacoby and also Dr. McGinn is, do you have personal stories you want to share in terms of coming to non-belief?
This is the first time I have ever been asked this question.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I was brought up as a Catholic, but not. I now realize my parents were not the usual pre-Vatican II Catholics. You know, when I would disagree with something a nun said, it was just, get along. You don't have to believe what they say. But just don't argue with them. So this is really a classic mixed message. But I do remember, we'll leave the theodicy problem aside for tonight, because I think everyone who stops believing in God really, really does stop believing in it ultimately because of that. But I do remember one thing, and I remember it very clearly. In catechism classes, there was the Holy Trinity, which is essentially, it's an illogical idea even to a child. How can there be three persons in one God? And one of them was the Holy Ghost running around and so on. And so what the nuns would answer in catechism class was that it was like a shamrock. There are three leaves in the shamrock. No, I guess some of you aren't Catholics in the audience, or you would have heard this, ex-Catholics. The shamrock, that explained how there could be three persons in one God. And so what happened in Catholic school is when a question was asked that sister couldn't answer, the priest was brought in. Of course, he was a man, he knew better. And so I asked, I said, there are four-leaf clovers, so why couldn't there just as easily be four persons in one God? And they were going to bring the priest in, but instead the priest called my mother. And when I got home, this had all been because nobody had the answer for it. The four persons in God thing had been reported to her in my talking about the four-leaf clover. And that's when my mother said, that's not a bad question, but you really shouldn't be asking it. It's just going to cause trouble at school. And I was about 11 then. And it was kind of, I'd been thinking about this. There is nothing, as you said. You can always tell, what position an atheist comes from, and you do it always amazes me when I find people who don't know about the Holy Trinity. But certainly, the theodicy problem was the big thing, but certainly all of those inconsistencies which you get in the very stupid education, which was pre-Vatican II parochial school education, had a big influence on me.
Mm-hmm. Colin McGinn.
I don't have an interesting backstory at all.
I don't know how interesting
I wasn't
that
brought up in a religious way. I wasn't brought up in an atheist way, and so it wasn't much of an issue for me. For me, my main interest in life is philosophy. And so religion, it interested me when I got to the age of reason, about 18 or 19, because it raised philosophical questions. And still in philosophy, when I'm thinking about things, it's useful heuristically to talk about God when you're discussing various issues. So it did awaken in my mind philosophical questions, and I was interested in it for that reason, but not because there's any interesting dramatic story of me falling from belief into disbelief or anything of the kind. I was brought up in England when we don't have separation of church and state in England, so we had prayers and readings from the Bible every day. But to say that we believed in God would be a strange statement, because we were just schoolboys who just went to assembly and mouthed these words. So if you'd asked me, did I believe in God, I would have probably said, I suppose. It didn't have any meaning to me. I just went through those rituals. And when I got older and left school and didn't do that anymore, I just thought it through, because I became interested in philosophy, and I read Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, and so on. And that's when I sort of formulated my atheism when I was about 20 years old, which is now 40 years ago, and that's the way it's been.
Mm-hmm. So a book plays a key role, at least in allowing you to sort of articulate to yourself what it is you don't believe. One of the things that I wanted to ask, and I think this may be implicit, and one of the difficulties in talking about atheism in America is that it will, many people will see it as an individual, very much an individual thing. And the question that will arise from it then is, how does one articulate a series of public values that are applicable to more than an individual? I'm sure you've dealt with that as a philosopher.
I have. I teach it even. Yes, I mean, some people often think that if you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, then you can't have a morality, and there's no foundation to morality, and morality is in question, and so forth. And so they're worried that, if God is dead, then morality is going to go with him. And I think that's, you were saying earlier, you don't agree with that. It's amazing to me that people in the current world still think that way, because that view was refuted 2,500 years ago by Socrates in the what's called the Euthyphro argument, where Socrates made the point that you can't define goodness or rightness as what God commands, because the reason God commands it is that it's right. It's not right because God commands it. If God could command it, he could command anything to be right. He could command murder to be right. That is absurd, and we don't accept that. So God cannot be the foundation of morality in that sense. He can't issue from God's commands. Also, there's a secondary problem. Even if that were possible, there's an epistemological difficulty. How do you know what God's commands are? How do you find out? The only answer is you go to certain sacred texts which are interpreted by certain appointed individuals, priests and so forth, theologians, and they tell you what God's commands are as read through those texts. That's a very fallible procedure. Even for a theist, that's a very fallible procedure. Of course, when we read the Bible, we apply our own morality to it to decide which things we're going to select from the Bible. And some of it's very antiquated, and we think, well, we're not going to accept that. Morality has its foundation in just ordinary human reason. It's nothing spectacular. It's things like knowing that it's right to keep your promises, to repay your debts, to not cause harm. It's right to make people happy and produce well-being in people. It's all pretty self-evident and common sense, and that's the foundation of morality. There's no threat from atheism to morality at all. And you need morality anyway, and if you're a theist, you can't get around it and somehow think that you can take a shortcut through God to morality. You've got to think about morality critically and come to your positions. It's not that difficult to do because the basic points are pretty straightforward.
Is morality
Yeah,
self-evident?
well, no, I agree with nearly all of that, and I'm not sure that I hardly disagree at all. Let me put it this way: the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Scriptures describes God's issuing 10 commandments. Now, the obvious way to look at that text is you've got God who intervenes, tells the people of Israel, these are the rules you should live by. There's another way of looking at it, which I think is actually probably does better justice to the text than the drift of the book of Exodus taken as a whole, and it's this: that a people that does not organize their own human relationships along these lines is going to be worshipping false gods. In other words, you've got to get your morality right if you're ever going to get anything right about God, not the other way around.
Yes.
And that therefore one begins to think in terms of forms of society which are organized around idolatrous worship of false gods. Why? Because of the distortions of human relationships which are embedded in those forms of society. And I think that's a much, much better way of looking at it. It's actually a much more Jewish way of looking at things. That you begin with essentially how people relate and what God goes with that way of relating. And I think that that's really what the book of Exodus and the so-called Ten Commandments is about, not about a God voluntaristically imposing a will upon a people and telling them how to behave, as if that voice could become a moral authority for human beings. I agree with you, you see, in that way. I think one just has to look at the whole business the other way around. Well, the only thing is I just don't see it as entailing atheistic conclusions.
What I want to do here is
you asked about public atheism and public principles, and they both began to talk about morality. Here is where, I mean, obviously morality has something to do ultimately with public principles. Here is where I think secularism and secular are better approaches if you're talking about public principles. Because, for example, you know, if you talk about the commandment, thou shalt not kill, which is really the commandment, thou shalt not murder. And all of the dispute, the practical disputes that are thought of as religious, or maybe thought of some way. In other words, what I'm saying is I don't think atheists can formulate public principles at all. The whole question of what does thou shalt not kill mean in society, or thou shalt not murder, revolves around how you define murder. And that obviously, neither religion nor atheism defines self-defense as murder, although it is a killing. The whole dispute over abortion is whether it is murder or not, and it all revolves around the question of how you define murder. And I think talking about either atheism or religion in a broad sense about that is, are you looking at this from a secular point of view, or are you looking at it from the, you know, a sort of, you know, point of view of eternal morality? So I think secular is a useful word when you're talking about public principles.
Thank you. Yeah, but now one of the things that that seems to come out of this, and an obvious question, is when we particularly talk about false gods, can reason be a false god? And one, of course, thinks of, say, the cult of reason in, yes, revolutionary France, and where that actually took.
It was unreasonable. It wasn't reason. It was craziness.
Okay, a false god there.
Look, reason. I mean, one of the things, can reason be a false god? Reason isn't God. Unreason is all around us now. I mean, we don't even need to dispute this. There's never been such a thing as a society of perfect reason. And to talk about, for instance, Jacobin France, which used principles like reason, when in fact it was an example of unreason, every bit as big an example of unreason as the Inquisition, or whatever happened in the Gulag, or whatever happened in Darkness at Noon. One of the things that I get on faith all of the time is that communism is a secular philosophy. Therefore, it shows that secularism can be as bad as religion. Well, of course it can, because unreasonable, very bad people are very well distributed across the religious, the secular, the atheist spectrum, whatever you want to call it. That's why I think, that's why I think in a way debates about the existence of God are pointless. We need to be talking about what we're doing here on earth, what seems reasonable to reasonable people who can be religious people or atheists, not some division between reason and religion as though they were total opposites.
I think both sides, well, perhaps Susan, you and I are in danger of a certain kind of moral priggery here. Just as you would not wish to be saddled with the perversions of reasonableness that are to be found in Jacobin France or in Stalinist Russia or whatever it is. I don't, as it were, land you with responsibility for the history of atheism, which, shorter than that of Christianity, has done pretty effective amounts of damage. Any more than I would wish to be saddled with the perversions of Christianity. Now, the trouble is, though, that, you see, I'm reminded of the other Marx, Groucho, in this connection.
A very reasonable man.
That he wouldn't want to be a member of any club which was corrupt enough to want him to be a member of it. Well, I actually don't think I would want to belong to a church which wasn't corrupt enough to have even me in it. And I think one has to take some responsibility, as it were, for the communities which organize, as it were, construct, and historically transmit the views that one espouses. So I think perhaps we ought not to sit here being on moral high ground because we can, as it were, detach ourselves from the sets of responsibilities we engage with when we adopt certain positions. So I am saddled with the sad history of the corruption of the Catholic Church, to which I continue to belong, on grounds which I borrow by inverting Groucho Marx.
Yes, but the difference between you and me is you are a member of the Catholic Church. Atheism is not a church.
No, but there are those who have claimed to organize forms of society around an atheistic belief.
How does atheism work then, to get back to an earlier question, as an organizing principle? Or is it that way? Or something has to be substituted for it, is that right?
I think it doesn't work as an organizing principle. It's just a
Absolutely not.
label for a set of beliefs that people have who reject traditional religions. So it's people who believe in science, they believe in art, they believe in philosophy, they believe in whatever else we think is valuable in life. They believe in all those things as much as anybody does, and they organize their own lives, and they think of politics and public policy in those terms. So the label atheism doesn't express anything in content. It just happens to be the case that we live in a society where some people do believe in these things, and others don't. And I'm including Dennis here too, because he doesn't believe in lots of the things that people think are true religious beliefs also. So it doesn't give any content to what you positively think about things. That's where things get interesting. Of course, what do you think about science,
You know,
politics,
two years
and so on?
ago, I would have agreed with you. And atheism is not an organizing in principle in the way that somebody who believes in an absolute leader, but it affects more than you think it does, and it affects every aspect of your life, not in the sense of an old friend of mine years ago, said to me, when first black was being used to replace Negro, he said, I don't look in the mirror and think up and say, hi there, you're a black man. Well, I don't get up in the morning and brush my teeth and look in the mirror and think, hi there, you're an atheist. But it does affect everything. I had a partner of 30 years who died 2 years ago and who had Alzheimer's disease. And I want to tell you that atheism, in a sense, is not an organizing principle, but it's an animating principle involving both reason and emotion, because I must have thought every day while this was going on for years how terrible this would be for me if I were a religious person. Because I would have to answer the question that occurs to everyone, whether religious or atheist. How could a loving God allow this to happen to a brilliant person? And for the first time, I felt emotionally a deep sense of satisfaction and happiness that I was an atheist, that this was not a question for me, that this was just a terrible biological thing that's happened, and that is the way it is. So to say that atheism is not an organizing principle is true, but it is, like religious belief, it is something that affects very deeply many aspects of your life, which you don't realize until it affects them.
I think that's
But by
true.
saying that, what's so interesting is I think you identify right there a source of conversation, possible conversation with religious believers. Do you not? Do you think so, Dr. Turner?
Yeah, what I sort of, I was following what you were saying, Susan, and I rather agreed with that, and I see you nodding, because at least you would have this preference about the way things are, that I didn't continue to believe in the existence of God. Isn't that right? I mean, there's something that you want not to happen.
Yes.
Right.
And I represent its happening, at least in some form or other.
Yeah.
And even if I am prepared to detach myself intellectually from the abuses of Christianity, which are most strikingly, shockingly scandalous, nonetheless, I still hang on to a residue of belief which you'd rather see I didn't. So yes, there is something you are for, put in that. Unfortunately, I agree with you in those terms of anti-theist, as if it was just sort of a negativity. And I've already said why I would want to take on board a great deal of that negativity and internalize it within my very business of belief. So, yeah, I think that it's true, there are no hierarchies of atheism, as you say, but there is something campaigning about it, I think, isn't there? I mean,
it matters if you live in a world in which there are theists and atheists, then it becomes more of an organizing principle.
Yeah.
If you lived in a world where there were no theists at all,
Sure.
you just have your positive beliefs about the universe. Man is mortal, the universe was created, we don't know how. morality has a secular foundation. You'd have all those beliefs, and they would organize your life, those beliefs. But we only express this as atheism because there are theists out there, and we're contrasting ourselves with them. But my point was only, if you look at the positive content of what somebody believes who's an atheist, it's not the negative belief there's no God, but that doesn't do very much for you. It's just the positive beliefs you have, which you use that label for. Particularly things like human life is mortal, there's no heaven, there's no divine retribution, there's no divine reward. Those things make a huge difference to your life. But so in that sense, I agree with you on that point. But I don't like to think that I'm defined as an atheist, as if that summarizes what my belief system is.
No, I was only saying that it affects the way you live in ways that you don't realize, and I'm sure religious believers feel that too.
Right.
But I think that the positive thing, the reason why I don't and by the way, I couldn't care less about converting religious people to my point of view. It's why I never participate in debates about the existence of God. But all the time, I have good friends who are liberal religious believers, and I've been told very often, I feel sorry for you because you don't believe in God. I would never tell you that I feel sorry for you because you're a religious believer. And I think it's not beside the point that you both were born English. When you grow up as an American, you feel the force of compulsory, oppressive belief in a way that definitely people who grow up in most of Europe do not.
No, that's absolutely right. And there is a very peculiar, distinct character to the American debate, which I think is lost on English people who just don't have it. But you might feel sorry for me if I said to you that what organizes my life, what my life gets organized by, is the image of an executed criminal who, as he's dying, says to God, "Why have you abandoned me?" Now, that's what I go for.
Before we go too far,
I don't feel sorry for you.
Wait, one thing we've got to do, though,
I'd feel sorry for myself if I believed that.
There's something deeply ironic in talking about oppression in the United States, whose principles of religious liberty were essentially established by two men, Madison and Jefferson, who referred to religion as opinions. And not dismissing them by any means, but recognizing there was tremendous diversity and that the country would be founded on a principle of religious liberty, which it has certainly enjoyed in terms of its diversity, which is not to say that people who are atheist or agnostic don't feel social pressure or perhaps political pressure too. But that brings me around to something else, and this is perhaps a more practical question that I've wanted to ask all three of you. One as an American, two as British. If we look at that, and I'm going to refer back to that City University of New York graduate school study that showed in 2001 a large group of unaffiliated people growing from the past study in 1990 to something like 15 or 16%. You're well familiar with that, I think, Ms. Jacoby.
It's more now,
Yeah. What does that mean politically for the United States?
Are you asking me?
Yes, why don't you start?
Okay, what does it mean politically to the United States? It means that secular people are a larger minority, but still very much a minority. And in fact, this is it's one of the ironies of religion in the United States really over the last 40 years, which is at both ends, both the most conservative precincts of Christianity and the secular side have increased. And I think that is really responsible for a lot of the intense cultural conflict. And a lot of secular people think religion runs everything. Well, religion runs more than secular people do, but a lot of very conservative religious people think that secular people who have total contempt for their values run everything. I am not the least bit surprised that to read that when Obama's social secretary Desiree Rogers was dumb enough to say to some reporter that the Obamas were going to have a non-religious Christmas in the White House, that immediately the creche was there. Because if they had decided not to have a creche there, they don't have a menorah there, but there's a menorah right on the National Mall, all you would have to do is to say that. You know, maybe even the Christian right wouldn't have noticed if the creche was left out. But the social secretary needs to take lessons from Miss Manners, because in America, once you draw attention to things that people think they're losing, and one of the things that deeply conservative religious people think they're losing is an America, in fact, that never was, in which conservative religion dominated everything. Once you draw attention to that, people become more fierce about that. I mean, atheists there wouldn't be anything on an atheist blog complimenting the Obama White House for not having a creche. We probably wouldn't have noticed either. But there's this sense of aggrievement, and it's partly based on really a mythical past. Mm-hmm. Not that Americans weren't religious, but it is true that religion for a long time was regarded as a private matter. And certainly the thing that the right wing can never get around is that God isn't in our Constitution. And the fact, and what they say, the explanation they come up with is that God was so taken for granted that they didn't have to put it in the Constitution. No, to say that men like Jefferson and John Adams were careless in their use of words is ridiculous. They were the most careful people in their use of words who probably ever founded any government. And in fact, all through the 19th century, especially in the Civil War, there were attempts to put a Christian amendment in the Constitution. I see American history as a tension between secularism and religion, in other words, not one or the other having dominated, and that tension exists today. It existed in the writing of the Constitution as well.
Dr. Turner,
it's very difficult for a foreigner like myself to understand this aspect of American public life. In Britain, you, formally speaking, have a state church, and yet it doesn't make the blind bit of difference to one person when it comes to a political issue. Here, you've got formal separation of church and state, and religion is all over your politics.
But that's why.
No, I mean, actually, Marx, in a very early work of his on the Jewish question, actually predicted this about America. He said he was talking about Prussia and state church in Prussia, and said, well, what to do about that, and pointed to America, where you've got this secular constitution, as a result of which he predicted, more or less, Californian religion.
Yes.
And it reminds me of something that Chesterton once said, and that is, when people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, it's that they'll believe in pretty well anything. And and that is, what American...
Is that how you're characterizing California?
What?
Yeah,
now, wait a minute.
Sorry, I didn't mean to offend California. That was just sort of...
You couldn't be
image of
more right.
wackiness.
It's one of the great ironies of American life, which is in Europe, not so much in England after the 19th century, but in Europe, if you were opposed to the government, since church and state were united, you had to be opposed to religion.
Yeah.
Whereas they didn't have anything to do with each other. If you didn't like your religion in America, there was all this land, you moved somewhere else and founded your own religion. And if you were persecuted like the Mormons, you just moved far enough so that you finally outran all the people who wanted to kill you. This was not a possibility in
I seem
Europe.
to remember it's a sociologist called Turner who
Yes,
gave
indeed.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's have Dr. McGinn, please have your say on this.
I agree
Miami.
with almost everything that was said there. My comment, going back to your original question, is it does seem to me that American society is becoming more secular, and people are more willing to label themselves agnostic, atheist, post-theist, or whatever, and that can only be a healthy thing, because, of course, the iron grip been held by the right wing in this country has proceeded through religious belief far too much. If you've got a substantial minority of people who are unaffiliated, agnostic, whatever we're going to call them, then that power shifts away from the religious right and more toward the center of people's beliefs. And so it can't be used to win elections anymore, the way it could in the past. So this relatively small increase of atheists and non-believers might have very large impact on American politics in the future.
A look to the future seems to be a wonderful way to bring this terrific discussion to a close, but I do want to do one thing for the benefit of the audience here, and that is to give each of you a chance to, for the sake of people who would like to go further, to recommend some books, and they can be entirely your own. But let's take 60 seconds with each of you, Dr. McGinn.
Books on this issue of...
Yes, on this issue, anything that you think would further elucidate our topic for the audience.
I thought Bertrand Russell wrote some quite good things. I've read, the Dawkins and the Christopher Hitchens books. I think they're fine as far as they go. I mean, they seem boring to me, but people seem to need to read them.
Well, something that's not boring.
I'm not going to recommend them as books I think are particularly terrific books. So it really fits my position. It's not a subject I find particularly intellectually stimulating.
But Bertrand Russell, at least.
Bertrand Russell, I'm going to mention.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Turner.
You've you sprung this on me. I think just the first few pages, 20, 30 pages perhaps, of a book by a Dominican priest called Herbert McCabe, simply called God Matters, it's back in print, might raise the stakes a bit as to what it is that you've got to deny if you're seriously into the business of denying the existence of God.
All right, thank you. And his name again, just so?
McCabe.
McCabe.
Yeah, Herbert.
Herbert McCabe.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
God Matters.
And Ms. Jacoby has two very well-known books out.
I actually, for things about church-state issues, I would recommend my Free Thinkers. But for a very interesting thing, which is by someone who was raised as a strict Hasidic Jew, but who really is grappling with problems of philosophy and how you move from very restrictive belief to another kind of belief system, I would recommend Rebecca Goldstein's Betraying Spinoza. And I'd recommend Spinoza too, by the way, if you haven't read him. But Betraying Spinoza, although it's written by someone who was raised as an Orthodox, extremely conservative small c Orthodox Jew, it deals with many of the issues of people who've been raised in a kind of closed universe and how you think about other universes. I think it's a marvelous book. I've just read it, and I would highly recommend it for something general about the kinds of questions we've been discussing. I would not recommend Dawkins or Bertrand Russell, whom it's very interesting. I read Bertrand Russell. If I wasn't already an atheist, he might have made me back into a believer. It bored me so much. But it's a chacun son goût.
All right, Betraying Spinoza, but be careful with your Bertrand Russell, all right? And thank you so much to the panel tonight.